Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Relentless Watchman podcast. Today we will talk very briefly about a proposed bill out of the Florida legislature by a lawmaker that goes by the name of Al Jacquet, possibly Jacquet. The bill that he proposed basically says that a mental health evaluation will become part of the license requirements to receive a concealed carry license in the state of Florida. Now, we believe that this is a very dangerous bill because of some simple historical facts. Gun control legislation, historically, has been applied to certain individuals and groups, historically, that were deemed unfit by the government to possess weapons. And we are going to read a little bit of a piece that was written by who I believe was a student at the University of Rhode Island. His name is David Babat, Babat, and this piece was written in 2009. The title of this piece is called "The Discriminatory History of Gun Control." Basically, this short read that we're going to do in this brief podcast will give you the insight necessary to understand why gun legislation like this is dangerous. It opens the door for discriminatory policies that can be applied to, just like history has shown us, certain groups of people who the government deem unfit to carry or possess firearms. This dates back to slavery on up to the modern era. Even in the late 1960s, where both Democrats and Republicans came together to deny black people, who they considered militant groups, weapons. They caved in together along with the great NRA. All of these groups came together to say, okay, yeah, let's create legislation that limits a person's ability to possess and carry firearms. So, we will start with this introduction. Once again, this is The Discriminatory History of Gun Control by David Babat. He has an email by which he can be reached at dbabat@gmail.com. Gun control in the United States is based on a long history of discrimination, which continues to this day. While blacks were the first targets of gun control measures, different racial and ethnic minorities have been targeted over time, and today the poor now face economic discrimination in many gun control laws. Gun control may be portrayed as a measure to reduce crime, but even in its earliest forms, firearms regulations have been used as a means to control specific societal groups by keeping them from possessing weapons. The first selectively restrictive gun control legislation was enacted in the pre-revolutionary South and primarily aimed at keeping free blacks from owning firearms and maintaining a white monopoly on power. Many different forms of gun control laws were implemented before and after the revolution to keep firearms out of African American hands. Even after the Civil War, black codes were enacted, which ensured that supposedly free blacks would not have effective means to defend themselves and would remain an unarmed and subordinate group in society, unable to defend themselves or fight for their legal and constitutional rights. By the end of the 19th century, the focus of gun control shifted from predominantly anti-black to anti-immigrant legislation. This was also the first time that gun control was enacted in the northern United States, where there were almost no firearm legislation in place prior to the late 1800s. With the arrival of European and other immigrants in the country, anti-immigrant prejudices arose and anti-immigrant groups did much to associate immigrants with crime. Unlike the South, Northern gun laws were much less explicitly discriminatory in their aims and their terms. In particular, discretionary permitting allowed authorities to selectively issue licenses and was tantamount to absolute authority to deny permits to immigrants or other supposedly dangerous elements of society. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was another major shift in firearm restrictions. The supposed aim of this bill was a reduction in crime, but an underlying motive was to keep black militant groups from arming themselves with readily available and inexpensive weapons. The new objective became the removal of inexpensive firearms from the market. Banning cheap guns was justified as a safety precaution to protect consumers and a way to keep criminals from accessing cheap firearms. One of the major accomplishments of this kind of legislation, however, was keeping guns out of the hands of the poorer people in society. The poor had truly become the primary target in gun control. Gun bans were instituted in order to keep the poor from legally possessing firearms. On the surface, this seems like a reasonable way to keep guns out of crime-prone areas. In reality, it ensures that criminals will be the only people possessing firearms. People who obey the law but need housing assistance will have no means to protect themselves. Some may argue that this prejudice is a necessary evil in the quest to reduce gun violence. Many criminologists conclude that the mere availability of firearms does not necessarily lead to gun violence. Like most scholarly subjects, however, there are disagreements in the field. The merits of some of these counter-arguments will be discussed later in the paper. Although it may seem initially counterintuitive that gun control is not an effective means to reduce crime, it will be demonstrated that the demand for firearms by criminals will exist regardless of their legality. Felons account for the vast majority of homicides committed with guns, and by definition are not legally allowed to even possess firearms. The actual effectiveness of any proposed gun control must be evaluated for its potential positive impact on crime rather than its emotional appeal. Now I will stop there and once again reference the article because it is a very good read and has some good historical information. Once again, the article is called The Discriminatory History of Gun Control, written by David Babat. David, B-A-B-A-T is the last name. He made some very good points in the article, as well as referencing some parts of history that demonstrates how government control given to them by legislation has been misused, and that is the primary reason why we must all oppose legislation like this one that was proposed by Mr. Jacquets. Now, I'll never really judge the intentions of the people he might be well-intentioned, just malinformed. That happens a lot with people in academia, folks that have never had to really deal with the violence. Not saying that he has not. They can make many assumptions and can conjure up many different ideals that they may believe would be effective. But the true people who are best able to gauge the effectiveness of any legislation and its application to gun control would be those who suffer from illegal ownership. Those would be the best people to talk to about gun access, gun control, gun legislation. How can we prevent a lot of these shootings that we see on a daily basis? Although there are very few that get the attentions in the poor neighborhoods, you don't see it get the national attention on the national news, but they occur every day in communities across the country, especially in our big cities and our poorer areas in these big cities. There's no better person to be able to speak on the issue than those that suffer from it. And the access to firearms might be one that can be solved by some type of alternative, maybe legislation, but an alternative to what we see on a daily basis. Like, okay, we're just going to continue to restrict, but it's only really being applied to people who actually care about obeying laws. We see all the time, and especially those of us who are in law enforcement, most of the people who use firearms for illegal violence are those who could care less about the laws that apply to firearm ownership and use of force. They're not going to go to a class to learn of it. They're not going to read the statutes. They don't care. They have evil intent, and they're going to go about, receiving or purchasing or stealing a firearm by any means necessary, because that's the tool of their trade. And they don't care about what the repercussions are. On the other hand, you have the law-abiding citizen who wants to know. They want that information because they want to be able to use it properly. But those are the ones that you're creating more and more restrictions on, because they are the ones that care. They are the ones that are going to have to go to get that mental health evaluation, not the person who's actually going to use those firearms for violence. So what we should be focusing and concentrating on is, how do we get them out of those hands? How are they getting in those people's hands, and stop them? And a lot of times legislation is not what's necessary. Sometimes it's education. A majority of the people that I've dealt with in law enforcement who have used firearms illegally in violent crimes did not purchase that firearm at all. Most of them were stolen. I've arrested people who had, in Chicago, who had stolen firearms out of Maryland. So we need to follow, how are these guns getting from this place to here? Who dropped the ball and enabled that gun to be stolen? And then educate people on how to better protect their guns. We do that all the time at Watchman Security Services. We give people strategies to protect their firearms from theft. And these strategies are not expensive. A lot of people think, oh, if I'm going to get a gun safe placed in my car, it's going to cost me hundreds of dollars, and it does not. You can have a gun safe that costs $40 mounted under your seat or in your glove box. And it's something that you can actually do yourself. You know, it's not impossible for the DIYer or do-it-yourselfer. So just simple tactics, or just keeping the gun on your body at all times. You know, make plans to go places that you have to go to, and have a strategy to assure that your firearm is not in a position to be stolen if you have to go to those places. But if you do not, if there is a way that you can do something different in order to not have to go to a place that bans firearms, and I'm talking about like a government building, not a restaurant, because we all know that you don't have to go to that restaurant. You don't have to go to Kroger, or who else is banning? Well, they're only banning open carry, so you should still carry a firearm. So, sorry, Kroger, we take that back. But strategize. If you need groceries and you know that this is not acceptable here, or if you want something to eat, you know that they say no firearms, go somewhere else. And keep that gun on your body. That way you know it's not getting stolen. You know that we are advocates of concealed carry. We just believe that it gives you an edge on one that is open. And I say that because we've seen on many occasions in our training, mostly law enforcement training, that the people with the open firearms are targeted because people come in with the intentions of committing a robbery, and they know that that person is in their way. So they use an ambush strategy and fire upon, shoot, and many times kill that person that has that open carried firearm. Of course, if you're working in a security position, then you should have a high degree of suspicious alertness and be alert to those pre-attack indicators prior to them even entering. You should have a clear view of the outside so you can have preparation early. But as concealed, or as a legally weapon carrying citizen, it's best if you don't show the gun. Simple as that. You have a heads up because they don't know that you have it. But getting back to the point, legislation does not have to be a bad thing, but it needs to be focused, and it shouldn't affect the person who is law-abiding. So when we have an issue where that is a possibility, we'll just say no. Say no to the legislation. It is no good. If it's going to be applied to legally law-abiding citizens, legally carrying law-abiding citizens, then no. Legislation should affect that small percentage of people who do not care about it, who are going to steal guns and going to commit violent acts, not the person who's going to carry a firearm for protection of themselves or their loved ones. And this is something that we need to all be aware of. Tell a friend. Send the article out. Text it to people. Place it on your social media websites, because this is something that could occur throughout the country. This is a Republican state, if I'm not mistaken. There's a Republican majority in their state legislature. But they're attempting to push this law, or this proposed law. They're proposing this law. So imagine a state that's heavily Democrat. And we're just assuming that, Democrats are the ones that like to push for more gun legislation. This could happen in your state. This can be a tool that is used against you due to the racist or discriminatory practices which we have seen in modern history being applied by a person or persons or entity, government entity, that just doesn't believe that a certain group of people are worthy or should have a firearm. It's dangerous. We cannot allow things like this to happen. So, like I said, this was a very, very brief podcast entry, and it was just something that needed to be discussed. It needed to be talked about. Information needed to be put out, and we all need to share it, and we all need to be cognizant of the fact that this could hurt law-abiding citizens. And we just say no. We vote it down, and then we continue to look at these individuals that we placed in office, and then we must consider whether or not they belong in that position. Either that, or they need to talk to the people and see what's on the people's mind, not push something like this, because I don't believe that a majority of people would agree with this, especially people who have been on the bad end, on the business end of these discriminatory practices. And that's basically most American people. Because if we look at Europeans, they're all immigrants. So at one time, this legislation was pointed at you too. It's not just an anti-black thing. It could be an anti-anybody. Anti-poor, anti-white, anti-black. We don't know. And that's the scary part of it. It could be applied at their leisure, at their discretion, in order to prevent people from legally carrying firearms. So once again, please share this information, share this podcast, share the article, look up the article and post it everywhere that you can, and leave a short message to go along with it that we cannot allow discriminatory practices in this day and age. We cannot give anyone that power to be able to make their own judgments of whether or not a person is worthy of of a means to protect themselves, not just a firearm, something to protect themselves, because we know that the criminals will not abide by that. They do not care and will continue not to care. And then we can go deeper and say that we need to really be focusing our attention on the prevention. We need to stop adding to these criminal ranks. Criminals have to be replaced. You know what I mean? There's an endless cycle of criminality. So there's always new ones, new generations coming behind them. So we need to really concentrate on what's going on to get people to that point to begin with. And let's focus some legislation and some funds toward deterrence instead of hurting the law-abiding citizen. So I thank you once again for listening to this very brief podcast episode. As always, we hope that it was helpful to someone, and always keep in mind that our first and primary goal is to keep people safe, and the only way that we can keep ourselves safe against those who would hurt us, especially those who are armed illegally, is to be armed ourselves. Thank you once again. This is the Relentless Watchman Podcast. Have a great evening.